now it is your turn. Dr. Thomas Hylland Eriksen, professor in the Department of Social Anthropology at the University of Oslo. Welcome to the stage. Your session is indeed called Roots and Boots, Identity in a Changing Time. So welcome.
Yes, thanks very much. Thanks very much indeed, and thank you for the opportunity that I'm being given to speak of issues which are of great significance in this day and age. I mean, you can hardly open a newspaper without being made aware of, in one way or another, squibbles about identity. I mean, Professor Kurt Rice just mentioned, I mean, the recent debate we've been having in Norway around the relationship between Norwegian and foreign staff or faculty at institutions of higher education, and which has generated a lot of emotion, far more emotion, far more passion than most debates that we see, where clearly something important is at stake for people. And then, I mean, just as I was coming here this morning, I was, as I often do, reading the New York Times on my mobile phone, okay? And there were no less than 2 articles on the front page of the New York Times about critical race studies, you know, which has become a very contentious question in the United States, and where there are lots of rumors, many unsubstantiated, a lot of fake news and heated discussions, but also some real disagreements about the significance of race and the way in which we should talk about race, not least in school. And it seems to have been decisive, you know, just now in an election in was it in Virginia, I think, where the question of critical race studies, in fact, seemed to have tipped the scales towards Republicans because of some false rumors that had been spread about how children in school should be brainwashed to learn that white people were all racist, even if they didn't know that they were. So, I mean, I mean, as a way of saying that the debate about identity, belonging, is not new, but there is something new about the way in which it is being dealt with today. And I think if I were to just say one thing about the way in which the debate has changed in the last, say, couple of decades. Well, I have to say 2 things, okay? And then some more things afterwards. One is that there has been a perceptible shift in politics across the world from class to identity as a focus for political allegiance. You know, I mean, in the 1970s and 1980s, I mean, when Kurt Rice and I were sort of young men and trying to orient ourselves in the world, class was the big question, the big issue. Inequality. There was Marxism, there were liberals, there were people who somehow dealt with class identity. The trade unions were powerful in many countries, and the political parties were conveniently arranged, organized on a left-right sort of dimension, okay, to the left or to the right. And the common view in Scandinavia was that, well, you know, in the Soviet Union, okay, they've sort of done away with some of the inequality. I mean, it's a more equal society. And they have a lot of security, but they don't have a lot of freedom. They have no freedom, because if you speak your mind, you're sent off to a gulag or to work in the salt mines for the rest of your life, or you just disappear. Whereas in the United States, the situation was the opposite. They had all the freedom they could dream of, certainly regarding freedom of expression through the First Amendment. But they had so little insecurity that people had to sleep with a gun under the pillow for fear of outsiders. So in Scandinavia, we'd found the balance, okay, between security and freedom. So this was about class. Now there has been a shift, very perceptible, towards identity as a focus. Think about India, which is now governed by right-wing Hindu populists. It wasn't the case. You know, the Congress party, Nehru's party, they were concerned with development and with inclusiveness, and they had debates about ways in which they could include the low caste and the so-called untouchables in the public sphere. And they regarded Muslims as Indians. They were Indians. They lived in India. They were born there. Whereas Hindutva bases its politics, the BJP, the current governing party, Modi's party in India, bases its politics on suspicion towards others. a political strategy that we recognize from many parts of Europe as well. And that was just one example. I could have gone on, but you see what I mean. This shift has been very clear, and it is no longer easy to arrange political movements on the simple sort of left-right dimension, because we have to deal with the way in which they talk about identity. I could have gone on at length about how this is being played out in a country like Norway, but I won't. So that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing I wanted to say is that one of the reasons that there is such a passionate debate about identity is uncertainty. It's a general uncertainty. There has been a general destabilization of identities. It is no longer clear, if it ever were, how to be a good man. What is it? I mean, how do you go about to be a good man? There's no script. The script has been lost. There are no rules. You have to negotiate your gender identity as you go along. The other identities are also being destabilized. I mean, the gender identity as such, the trans movement, the LGBT movement, or LGBTIQ plus movement, to be accurate, shows that even gender identity as such is being contested. Which we've seen, I mean, only in the last few years. You said, well, I've seen this during the pandemic, okay, on Zoom meetings. That the convenient thing with Zoom meetings, for those of us who have difficulties remembering names, is that everybody's name is on the screen. At the bottom of the little two-dimensional picture of the person. And then sometimes they have a bracket after saying she, her, or he, him. Indicating which personal pronoun they prefer to use about themselves, which, honestly, I mean, it was not an issue, okay, a generation ago. J.K. Rowling, the famous author of Harry Potter, almost lost her credibility totally when she said something sarcastic about the destabilization of gender, because the word for women was meant, some people wanted to replace it, okay, with people who menstruate. Because, trans women, okay, they don't menstruate, but they have the right to be recognized as women. And J.K. Rowling said something sarcastic online about, we used to have a word for these people who menstruate in the past. I don't know, what was it again? It started with a W, I think. Was it woman? That sort of joke. And that joke was not received, I mean, as a sort of, as a fun thing in certain quarters. So why am I saying all this? Because the kind of identities which we will mainly be talking about here, I guess, are not gender identities. I mean, and they're not sort of the class versus other identities, but the questions to do with identity are far more comprehensive, and they penetrate into people's lives in a much more fundamental way than sort of superficial discussions about nationalism, ethnicity, and religion might suggest. So there is something here about how to be a good person, how to be the kind of person I want to be in the 21st century. And who's going to tell me? And how can I make sure that I am not doing the wrong thing? So these were the two things I wanted to say. As I always say when I've spoken for about half an hour after this short introduction. But now I will be a bit more systematic, because I think already two speakers have quoted the late Thor Heyerdahl for saying that, borders, I've never seen one, but I hear they exist in the minds of some people. And that's a wonderful quotation. But as a social scientist, I have to say, had it been so simple, the world would have been a different place. Yes, it's true, we cannot see the borders. When you cross between Norway and Sweden in a non-pandemic situation, you hardly notice it. You hardly notice crossing it. I mean, but then you get out of the car and you hear people speaking and you realize that, I mean, it's not an entirely foreign language, but it's a bit different. And there seems to be a linguistic boundary, okay? And in addition, there's a political boundary. If you live in Töcksfors, you pay your taxes somewhere else, okay? You watch your TV news, if you still do. If people still watch TV news, I'm not sure if they do, on a different channel. And the moment you cross the border, I drive across quite often to Sweden in non-pandemic times, and you listen to the radio, or you have a mobile phone connection. Suddenly the network changes. Suddenly, your radio signals shift, okay, to Swedish or Norwegian, and your mobile network shifts from Telenor to Telia or whatever. So there are, and these are just anecdotal examples of the fact that although we cannot see these borders, they're real. Now, let me dwell a little bit on the border between Norway and Sweden, because it said something about a historical development which is now being contested by social scientists and by others. But there has been a social development. And historically, we may say that the history of modernity and of nation building has consisted in the replacement of a world of many small differences with a world of just a few major ones, the national. Okay? And if you weren't a card-carrying member of the nation, either we forced you to become one through assimilation, we exterminated you, which was actually far more common than many people are aware, or we isolated you in some kind of enclave in a sort of hilly landscape where you couldn't do any harm, for example. Or we, those were the three main methods. You assimilated, you exterminated, or you excluded. You just threw them out. You said you've no business being here. So a world of many small differences was turned into a world of a few major ones. And since I started to talk about the Swedish-Norwegian border, let me just, use that as an illustration, and a linguistic illustration. Before the era of nation building, let's say before the mid-19th century, when it really took off, when there was a great concern with being a member of the nation and what it entailed and what it took. Before that, people didn't care. They were farmers or fishermen, or they may, if they lived in the town, they knew lots of different kinds of people because they traded with them and they had relationships with them, and it didn't really matter. But and in every little hamlet and every little valley you passed through, if you drove from Bergen to Stockholm, traveled, you couldn't drive in the 1840s. You traveled slowly, outdoors, unpleasantly, but still you stopped in every little hamlet and valley, and you noticed that they had their own dialect, and they were slightly suspicious of people from the neighboring valley. They had stories. Just like where we live. Sandefjord and Tønsberg have mutual stereotypes. There's a lot of narcissism of small differences. But yet, as they say in Africa, they are our enemies. We marry them. You built alliances and you had joking relationships, but you had your distinct local identity, which was very, very local. And around the border between Norway and Sweden, somehow the Swedish, the Norwegian dialects or accents, they merged into Swedish ones almost imperceptibly. And this can still be noticed on both sides of the border, where in Østfold, near the Swedish border, you have lots of Swedish words and Swedish sounds. The Østfold L is infamous in the rest of Norway for being sort of a distinct marker. And the same on the Swedish side of the border. You can hear the echoes of something which sounds a bit Norwegian. And when we travel to Göteborg from Oslo, you're sort of abroad, but you're not quite as much abroad as you are in Stockholm and Uppsala, because they face east. They're Baltic cities, and Göteborg is Atlantic and has this long-standing relationship with Denmark, Norway. So even today, we see remnants of a world of many small differences. And yet, as I said, the dialects merge into one another. You couldn't really tell where they stopped, and it didn't really matter because people didn't have a lot to do with the state. So the state was a very minor part of their life world. It didn't really matter. But today, you can clearly draw the boundary between the Norwegian and the Swedish dialects. And on both sides of the border, the variation, the linguistic variation is less than it was. Although it remains considerable in Norway, partly for political reasons, but it's less. Owing to the flattening, standardizing, homogenizing process of nation building. So this is something new. And I said 1850s, but we could move closer to our own time. And since we are in the residence of the Czech ambassador, Prague, until the Second World War, was a crossroads. It was a cultural crossroads. Like so many cities, It was a place where people, it was a meeting place, where you exchange goods, you exchange ideas, words, impulses. They were sort of these vibrant places where the whole point about the city was this was where people of different backgrounds actually met and did business together. And this goes a long way to explain the cultural creativity and the political creativity that we associate with the great cities of Central Europe, such as Prague and Vienna, which was the most exciting city in Europe before the 1930s, and which has been dead since. You know, since 1945, because the minorities, especially the Jews, disappeared. And with Prague, you had, you know, three big groups, okay? You had the German speakers, you had the Czech speakers, and you had the Jews, who were often German speakers, but often bilingual. Franz Kafka was perfectly bilingual. He could have written in Czech had he wanted to, and sometimes Yiddish. And that was typical, and it wasn't seen as a problem. Before the age of nation building, when suddenly whether you were this, that or the other became a big issue. I could have mentioned other cities. I could have spoken about Sarajevo, which was also one of those crossroads, you know, with Serbs, Croats, Bosnian Muslims and Jews, and a few others. I mean, Habsburgs, you know, in Sarajevo, you can still see the border, you know, between the Turkish and the Habsburg part of the city, which runs through the city centre. So it was this diverse place. It no longer is the case. You know, it's now, I mean, 98% or something Bosniak. And there are a few sort of Croat families who cling on, but who knows how long they're going to stay. So there has been this process of simplification. That is a job that has been performed by nation building. And this is also the straitjacket against which many react. And one of the reasons why the debate over boundaries and borders and identities are so heated these days, because people feel that they are locked in a straitjacket that they didn't choose themselves, which is that of a restricted sort of monocultural identity. But I have to move on. We're doing okay with time. I noticed that we are doing fine with time, but I won't take all morning because I have another few things I wanted to say. Now, the story I've told now may lead to the conclusion that we should sort of revert to the pre-nation building era, but I'm afraid there is no turning back. Just as the solution to climate change is not to become hunters and gatherers. We cannot. We're 8 billion, and we cannot all become hunters and gatherers, even if we may learn something from them. And what my message has been so far is that, yes, no, there's no turning back the clock, because there is something about the modern state that is hard to do something about. But maybe we can still learn something from the past and from others, and see how they deal with diversity, with difference. In the Pacific, in Polynesia, in Rapa Nui, and in, you know, other Polynesian islands, people deal with the cultural difference in a very different way from what we're used to doing in Europe. I mean, in Melanesia, it's quite common still in the Solomon Islands, for example, which has, you know, dozens of languages. Unlike in Polynesia, which is linguistically more homogeneous, that when two people meet, they might address each other in each other's language as a form of politeness, okay? In other words, if I meet one of you who has German as the first language, I should speak German to you and you should respond in Norwegian as a way of mutual way of showing respect. And showing that, in fact, cultural differences are not dangerous. On the contrary, they're quite enriching. But I will not dwell on the Pacific, but the point is that there are many different ways of dealing with diversity, and nationalism is just one. Okay, but borders do exist. As I said, the border between Norway and Sweden has become very real. We can draw the border, and it is. I mean, there are political entities. There are cultural identities, and even if they don't have the cultural identity, you have to pay tax in one country. So it has a very real existence, and borders do not merely exist in people's minds. And you know, the only thing that exists in the world are differences, in a certain sense. The only thing that exists are differences. If they didn't exist, nothing would exist. So identity is shaped by being different from something else. That's what defines identity. It's a contrast with something else. The problem today is that we have too little freedom. There are too few In many cases, you're only allowed to be one thing. I mean, Kurt Rice cannot be a foreigner in Norway because he doesn't fit. You know, he's white, he's well assimilated, he speaks great Norwegian with a slight North Norwegian accent, okay, after many years in Tromsø, and professionally successful. But you know, you still, but that kind of slot doesn't exist. So the simplification, there's a McDonaldization of identity going on, okay? The McDonald's logic, homogenization, simplification, standardization, cheap entrance ticket, short learning curve. You can learn everything you need on your mobile phone. You don't have to sort of read books, you know, that sort of thing, which enters into the world of identity as well. And this is what we should deal with, because these borders are real, and they're not just in people's minds. It's not enough to teach people about cultural diversity and the virtues of tolerance if you live in a profoundly unjust society. I mean, I've done much of my anthropological research in Mauritius, in the Indian Ocean, which is a culturally diverse place. It's not as culturally diverse as people think, but it's ethnically diverse, which means that people have different identities, they may speak different languages, but they say pretty much the same thing. You know, they aspire to the same careers, they have the same consumption patterns. So it's superficially very diverse, but not as diverse as many people may think. But it's also a society which is deeply committed to multiculturalism. You know, you have the Hindus, the Muslims, the Creoles who are Catholics, the Chinese, and even a sprinkling of people of European origin, who are the old elites. Les 15 familles, the 15 families who owned all the sugar estates, and who still to some extent do. But it's very tolerant, so that the Telugu have their annual celebration. Okay, the Telugu New Year, it's a public holiday, even though the Telugu are just 3% of the population. Every Monday, there's a Hindi film on TV, and they used to be. I mean, now people don't watch, they watch Netflix, okay? They don't watch TV anymore. But there used to be a Hindi film. Everybody watched the Hindi film, and it was subtitled in French so you could follow. On Friday, there was always a French movie. You see, that's the logic of multiculturalism. Every group should have their sort of place in the sun. And what was the unofficial national culture was Creole. That was the culture of people of African origin. The Sega music, you know, which is the sort of Indian Ocean version of the calypso and the reggae, and the blues. Every post-slavery society has its version of the blues. And in Mauritius, it's the Sega. So you have the Sega music with flowery skirts on the beach and lots of bee and drum and, you know, drumming. And you see what I mean, the unofficial national culture, which has been produced on site, not been imported from anywhere else. It was not Indian, it was not Chinese, it was not African, it was just Mauritian. Excuse me. And why am I saying this? I'm saying this because this is a society committed to tolerance and to respect and multiculturalism. And they're doing pretty well. It's peaceful, it's democratic, there's lots of corruption and lots of miscontent, but they have a free press. So they criticize the politicians all the time. And the healthy, sort of vibrant public discourse. Okay? And yet, this does not help to do anything about the social hierarchies. After 50 years of independence, with a multiculturalist ideology, you still have the 15 familles, who are called de Robiliard, and they have, you know, French sort of aristocratic names, who still own half the island. And if you're a Creole from a village, the chance of you getting a higher education is still less than 2%. So he doesn't, I mean, you can have a very multiculturalist society with lots of tolerance, which can be used to conceal the real facts of social hierarchy and inequality. So that it doesn't really, you see, it does solve some problems, but not all. Let me give you another example. In Cyprus, which is also a divided society, with Turkish speakers and Greek speakers since the 1970s, there may be an assumption from the outside that Turks and Greeks don't like each other because they have different religions and languages and eat different food. Well, I mean, if you go to Cyprus and you speak with people there, as I have, and as some of my colleagues have done to a greater extent than me, people who have carried out research, turns out that there isn't much by way of cultural animosity. You know, you speak to Greek Cypriots and they will say, you know, I rather like Turkish food. I think Turkish music is great. And you know, I mean, and the language is fantastic. You know, it's a rich sort of language which has produced great works of literature and poetry. And I don't mind their religion. You know, they've got their religion, we've got ours, and when you look closely, they're not that different. But, and then, because there's always a but, okay? The problem was that after the petition, so many people lost their property. And we know that these accusations are being made on both sides. You know, Greek Cypriots who feel that the Turks got more than their share when the island was divided, and vice versa. Turkish Cypriots who feel that the Greeks actually they took my grandfather's house. I mean, I'm not getting him back, and I haven't got anything by way of compensation. So this is not about cultural prejudice. It's about the feeling of injustice. Social injustice. So if you are a Palestinian on the West Bank, it doesn't really help to learn about tolerance and that you should regard the Jews as your equals when you live in one of those cramped settlements, which is almost like a warehouse, and one of those cramped settlements where you have a little bit of water dripping out of the tap about 2 hours a day, and then you look up to the illegal settlements. Okay, the illegal Israeli settlements, where they've got swimming pools and green lawns. So when you're confronted with this kind of situation, it doesn't help, to take courses in intercultural communication and tolerance. It can only take you so far. And this is one of the problems with some of the more idealistic views of identity. We think that if we only change people's minds, everything will be fine. No, we have to look at injustice and structural differences as well. So, and there are some wonderful books about tolerance, by all means. One of the best is by the Lebanese author Amin Maalouf, called in English Identities, I think Identities That Kill, something like that, yeah, from the 1990s. And he describes his background and his childhood in Lebanon, which is also diverse. With it's not just diverse in the sense of there being Christians and Muslims, but there are lots of different kinds of Christians and lots of different kinds of Muslims. And they don't really not necessarily see eye to eye. If you're a Maronite, I mean, that's very different from belonging to the Syrian Orthodox Church and so on. So it's really, and Beirut was, just like these great Central European cities, it was a crossroads, a place where people, and it has been, for 2,000 years. That coast was where the Phoenicians came from, the great traders of the Mediterranean in the ancient times. So, and then Maalouf says that the problem here is that people are taught to be suspicious of each other. They are being told from childhood that they should be suspicious of each other, and that is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. Because if you are a Maronite and you need a job, who are you going to ask? Who's going to help you find a job? Maybe your relatives, maybe their friends. Maybe people you went to school with, or maybe people you went to church with. And who are they? They happen to belong to the same group. I mean, it's the same as Mauritius. If you are a Hindu and you're looking for a job somewhere, the first people you may ask, the connections you have, the informal networks you have, are based on your religious and ethnic identity. Because you don't know. I mean, you have nothing against the Creoles, but you don't know any. So there's nobody you can ask. So what I'm saying here is that these group identities, they're also embedded in people's everyday lives. And we have to understand that if we're going to deal with them, and if we're going to deal with the problems of identity politics and intolerance. It's not just about changing people's minds, but it could also be about changing facts on the ground. So anti-discrimination policies, ensuring equal opportunities, and both nationally and internationally. I mean, I'm not going into the ongoing debate here now, but quite clearly, the just distribution of opportunities in the labour market, in education, in the housing market, so that even if your name is Abdul, you may actually be invited for an interview if you're qualified for the job, or if your parents came from Somalia, you can still rent a room. You're not being excluded. These material circumstances may be far more important. And do I have another 6-7 minutes? That's great, thanks. Yeah, because I want to tell another story from Norway, because it's been 20 years now this year, it was 20 years ago that a 15-year-old boy called Benjamin Hermansen was killed by neo-Nazi thugs in Oslo. And the only thing he had done wrong was that he had a Ghanaian father. You see, that was his only mistake. He had a Ghanaian father and a white Norwegian mother. So he was one of those very many people in this city with mixed ancestry, mixed origins. And there's been far too little attention to these people. Very few research projects. Research projects tend to focus on the Vietnamese or the Pakistanis or whatever. Lots of people have mixed ancestry. Now, Benjamin, when he was killed, it led to a national outrage. This, people felt, is not, this is taking things a bit too far. We don't want this. We don't want to live in this kind of society. So in January 2001, there was a mass manifestation at Youngstorget, one of the big sort of squares, okay, where, by the way, the socialists used to have their sort of mass rallies. I mean, they still have people, but not in the same way. So shift from class to identity. But at Youngstorget, mass demonstration. And can you imagine? This was in mid-January, one of the coldest days in the year. I mean, when I try to explain this to people from outside, I say that it was the same temperature as you have in your deep freezer. Okay? You don't explain this to people in Seychelles and Mauritius. You see, people were still standing outside with torches and banners and were chanting against racism. So that was wonderful. It was heartening. And yet, there's always a but with us academics. And yet, I think the next day, some of the people who really felt earnest about this went back to work. They were in the committee, hiring committee. I mean, someone had applied, lots of people had applied for a job, and a few of those applicants were called Fatima, Abdul, and so on. And somehow, for mysterious reasons, they were never called for interviews. They were never invited for interviews because they were called Fatima and Abdul, unconsciously. And this is what some Americans mean by structural racism. It's not that you are racist, I'm not racist, but it's part of the air that we breathe. You just do it instinctively. They wouldn't fit in, they're probably not as good. And we know a bit about this because social researchers have done experiments where they have submitted identical job applications with different names. Okay? Steinar Johnsen. Yeah, please come in and we'll ask you. Abdul, sorry about that. We already found someone else. But identical applications with the same credentials. So this is the kind of thing we should take seriously if we want to do something about this world of inclusion and exclusion. Now, towards the end, there are two things I want to say. And one is that since we are somehow in a small part of Central Europe here, and I think personally that the legacy of the Habsburg Empire, I mean, it's mixed, okay? But there are things to learn from the way in which they try to deal with identity in this multinational, unwieldy, unmanageable, bureaucratic, and ultimately dysfunctional empire. But when it came to ways of dealing with identity, they found solutions to the questions of nationality, which were ingenious and different from what we have subsequently. And one of the great authors from Central Europe, not from the Czech Republic, a little bit further south, but it's part of the same world, the post-Habsburg world of Central Europe. Claudio Magris from Trieste, this originally very mixed Italian. It's now all Italian, but with a little bit of Slovene, but it was very mixed, just at the end of the Adriatic Sea. And he writes in his beautiful book about the Danube that, being a fascist is not loving your fatherland or your motherland or your language or your 19th century romantic poetry or your folk music or the place you grew up. But it is doing all these things and not realizing that other people who may live in a different place, they also love their 19th century romantic poetry, their parents, their fatherland, the place they grew up, and they are just as valuable as you are. That is fascism, when you refuse to recognize that other people who have different experiences have the same value as yourself. And I think this is very much what is going on in our minds, since borders exist in our minds, and we have to deal with that. We have to deal with those prejudices, but it may be even more important to look at the facts on the ground. I mean, when I was many years ago, I was in Lahore in Pakistan, and I wasn't actually driving myself, luckily, but I was with a friend who was driving. And I said, I said, you know, bloody hell, mate, I'm sorry, pardon my French. I mean, how do you navigate this traffic? Because we see people, like, all kinds of traffic, auto rickshaws, cars, motorbikes, they were sort of swerving in and out. And he said, well, there's one thing, I mean, don't look at the sort of the things the driver does, I mean, with his lights or waving his hand out of the window, but just look at the wheels. You just have to look at the wheels of the vehicles in front of you, then you may be okay. So in other words, a very sort of materialist. So don't look at what people say, but look at what they do. That's really my message. And finally, how are we going to deal with this problem of mixed identities, destabilized identities, and the counter-reactions, the attempt to, again, sort of freeze identities which have been loosened up a bit? It's not easy. I mean, in the United States, I mean, there's still just one category for being black, whereas many of those people who are black would be considered more or less white in the Caribbean. You know, I mean, you know, when I did fieldwork in Trinidad, there was a very famous African-American professor who came there on the anniversary of the abolition of slavery to give a lecture at the university, okay, from Atlanta. And the first thing I noticed when he came into the auditorium was that he was wearing very sort of colorful West African clothes, okay, Nigerian clothes, lots of yellow and red and stuff. And why was that? Why did he do that? Well, in order to conceal the fact that he was nearly white. In the United States, because of the one-drop principle, if just one of your ancestors is black, your blood has been so badly contaminated that you are black. But not in the Caribbean, where you have the red skin, you have the olive skin, you have the Trinidad white, as they call them. Those are the people who are not really white, but they pass for white in Trinidad, and they have all sorts of nuances. And that's just color. What about other things? What about gender? Maybe we can think about different ways of being men and women, and maybe something else. And maybe that is not necessarily a problem. There is a concept, and I'd like to mention this right at the end, which has been introduced in social research on diversity in recent years, and which I think can be quite useful when we try, perhaps, to recover a world where it is possible to live with many small differences, in spite of all the forces that militate against them. And that is the concept of superdiversity. Superdiversity used about contemporary cosmopolitan cities, such as London and Paris and New York, which are crossroads where people meet, or Bombay, or Mumbai, as it is now called. I hesitated for many years using the word Mumbai, because it was coined by Hindu fundamentalists, but now it has become established. So, and Hong Kong, and there are many of these cosmopolitan cities which are crossroads. So the term superdiversity, okay, let me put it very simply. In the past, people went from a few places, came from a few places, and they went to a few places. Now they come from many places, and they go to many places. So that's part of the story. But it doesn't end there, because superdiversity also means that you don't really have settled communities in the way you used to. So that in London, you knew where the Jamaicans lived. And you knew that, you know, the Bangladeshis, they live in Tower Hamlets in the East End, and the Jews in North London, you know, near White Hart Lane, okay, Tottenham football stadium, and South Asians in certain parts of South London. No longer the case. People live all over the place. And also, you cannot predict anything about an individual just by knowing his or her ethnic background or national background, because Pakistanis cover the whole range. And we see that in Norway as well, where the Pakistani Norwegians are the most established of the non-European ethnic minorities, been there for 50 years. You can't really predict anything about a person by saying that, you know, they're Pakistani. I mean, we have a sort of deputy, possibly our next prime minister of Pakistani origin, but I think of her as someone from southwestern Norway, and a bit of a control freak. You know, she represents the same sort of part of the Labour Party as Gro Harlem Brundtland did. You know, there's continuity there. Very powerful politician. And then you had the previous Minister of Culture, who just had to resign, who was also Pakistani origin. Now, I never thought of him much as Pakistani either, unless when he mentioned it, which he did actually, because there were so many other things about him which were more important. So in other words, suppose we allow each other not just to be imprisoned by those straitjackets of ethnic, national, religious, linguistic identities, but to have a broader repertoire. that would help quite a bit. And in the end, if we manage to do that, if we manage to think in a super diverse way about the world, we're individuals when it comes to it, that will in the end also help Abdul and Fatima get a job. And if they do, that would have solved a lot of possible conflicts in the future. Okay, so well, I stop here and thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hylland Eriksen. I will say I want to also just applaud you on how many words you're able to bring to us in terms of your knowledge with having just a small little piece of paper to look at. That was very impressive. Thank you so much. We are